first of all, America has been foundation formed by industrial revolution. That's our history. We have, through genocide, destroyed the previous cultures that had an indigenous relationship to the earth. So that translation didn't transfer. So my total upbringing until leaving this part of the planet and going to another part of the planet was an industrial review of everything until the 60s, when the idea of freedom of expression, those people coming out of World War II and the Korean War, getting educated, they no longer wanted to follow any of those previous paths because of the horrific experiences they had in those particular conflicts that followed into Vietnam. So there was this period of time, brief period of time in America where that you could choose to be what you wanted to be. There wasn't that pressure that you're expected to become the doctor or the engineer. So by going to another part of the planet that had a pre-industrial history, a deep one, that particular relationship to the material became very important. So the experience of an apprentice going out with an elder, with a whole group of us with wheelbarrows and shovels and stuff like that, to go along a rice paddy field with wheelbarrows and stuff and to dig clay for the first time, hand dig it, was a totally new experience. So you got your shovel ready to go, and just a moment, that was Matsumoto-san, and he goes and folds his spiritual talismans and then takes a reed and puts that in the side of the clay bank, and then goes through a small ritual, throwing some little bit of rice grains and sake and stuff, and asks permission from the earth to take something from the earth, to extract something from the earth, to make human beings whole. That, I think, was a very powerful moment. As a young person in their 20s, that had a fairly big impact. And then came the layers and layers of how they translated the taste of clay, that you tasted the clay. And it became this metaphor for that you take and internalize the taste of clay into your soul and identity. So that became something that was totally devoid of what you had learned of industrial production, where that the material was already dead and God's will said you could harvest it at will, but the earth was a dead resource and it was made just for human beings to extract, not giving anything back. Here it was a totally different spiritual perspective that you weren't introduced to. So in that regard, then it layered and layered with the symbiotic kind of eco-mutualism of relationship to all the materials and everyday living. That the rice straw was woven into straw mats and straw sandals, and then the rice hulls were burned very slowly to make the ashes, to make the glazes, and the wood ashes out of the adorti were used to wash, to make, because it was a very slow burn there. You got really good quality ashes. Those are used to make glazes, and every part of their live system had an interrelationship with the creative system. It wasn't that you're going off to school to become creative. that every pattern of the live system had an interlocking form for human expression. That was also something that I had not experienced before. That, all the gardens and were always in a row, everything was always somehow in a manufacturing sense. Whether it was any kind of agrarian experience, it would become outside the industrial format. It was always part of the industrial format. So the reason for digging local clay here and starting out that foundation was an ecological, environmental framework. I made the decision that I will never buy any materials as best I can. Some of the industrial materials we use, like kiln shelves and wadding clay and those kinds of things that help us to get to that point of the relationship with the natural materials. We still depend on those. So that's a slow process to unlearn the processes you've been given prior to this. And Japan was also industrialized severely, but the area in Kyushu, because of World War I and World War II, had interrupted the Industrial Revolution going through Japan. There were still these beautiful remnants of indigenous systems that have been going for 200 to 300 years systematically. Everything was still intact, from handmade paper making to the way they processed their foods and the way they worked on all of their natural materials. So when Father Michael Blecker asked me to come to St. John's as their artist in residence, he realized from the letters that I was writing him from Japan that there was a direct connection to the previous Benedictine lives that he had the experience of as a novice coming into the monastery, and the young man still seeing the remnants of their agrarian life and how that agrarian life was slowly being cast aside to take on the educational mission. And so he kind of understood that in order to ground the monastery and the communities again, was that it was going to be impossible to go back to agrarianism in the way that Virgil Michael and Eugene McCarthy talked about the Back to the Earth movement. That was not happening at St. John's. They had went full in on corporate education. They're not coming out of it. But they wanted something that would connect a new translation of energy into reminding the community that there are patterns of indigenous systems that can be incorporated into an education and creative environment. So that's why he asked me to come to St. John's. So the clay deposit that we're using is 144 million years old. So one of the hardest things is that that's a number it's impossible to get your mind around. You just can't imagine 144 million years. Even though you listen to Stephen Hawking's, on the universe and all, you just try to get your head around it, but it's pretty difficult. But I try to explain is that clay deposit being here now for 144 million years and shaping and forming its plasticity, its pressure, it's now being pushed up by the glaciers to ready for a human being to touch, having access to that clay. That for shaping and firing and making is like a little laser light of time, just one fraction of 1/25 of a second of time that the human interacts with the material and changes it forever. It's changed forever. It's no longer clay. We've changed it forever. So I take that responsibility very seriously. That if you're going to take something from the earth and you're going to change it forever, that's serious responsibility. So the clay, when it speaks to you in different ways, but in order to have the best communication is that the clay then finds space for others. That what you're making, then there's a little bell that goes off inside a human being that says, this particular form and shape becomes a pattern way of living. And a pattern way of living is a ritual way of living. That you get up in the morning and you make tea out of your favorite cup or favorite cups, maybe rotate. You have these, when guests come, that you think of how you're going to bring a platter out. So someday when we can all have guests again, that the platters are filled with something you've created of food. So there's a certain functionality that I feel is important to communicate, that it's overused now. I hate, but it's very true in the sense of the rule of Saint Benedict is that you should treat your everyday tools as instrument of the altar. So I translate that as saying every tool or material that you use is if it's been shaped by a human hand that has been cared for, that is a sacred object, sacred pattern, a sacred form, and treated that way. That keeps those forms from going into garage sales or to be tossed out into a landfill. As many of our industrial products, because we don't know the type of tremendous work that other people on other sides of the planet are doing in abhorrent conditions, making those things for us. So I think that that's the clay is then very carefully cared for, very carefully aged. It's incredibly important material for the life of the potter and for the life of human beings. Industrialization is for one thing, and that's to make money for a narrow group of human beings that figured how to extract things quickly and get them into the hands of other people quickly so that their resources are then quickly extracted as well. And makers of earthen materials, pre-industrial revolution, never thought that way. They were making because they were trying to imbue a spiritual quality to what they were making so that they could be generationally handed down. So they were looking at generational transformation. So, yeah, it's I can't think of it, buying clay, I can't, it's very, I don't know how you could do it. and we don't sell the clay here. We give the clay away to other artists. Because then that's really a really tipping scale. You just can't do that. Every day I change something. So the material is not static at all. There is an old painter that I knew, and I used to take my students to see. And he was this very, very exacting watercolor painter, world renowned. His claim to fame in this particular region was he was the person who painted Betty Crocker. He took all these different images of this beautiful woman, beautiful women, and combined them to create this one woman, Betty Crocker. And so there's a big, beautiful portrait at the entrance to General Mills. And he taught for many years at the University of Morris as the painting instructor. But he did some of the most beautiful, beautiful still lifes that created power. So similar to like Kandinsky doing abstract still lifes to create an internal emotion. His were so exacting, they were just, and he stood at his kitchen, and all the students were kind of down the bottom of the stairs in his studio. And he looked at them and he says, the moment I step my foot across the threshold, I began to do battle with reality and vision and dreams. And he says, this will take me the rest of my life to do. And then he started showing people how many times he had scraped off this painting, 50 times, 20 times off the paper, to finally get to the emotion that this still life was bringing to him. And the right type of light, and the right type of vision. So that piece of rope, because he was talking about how his mother had to go to a sanitarium because she got multiple sclerosis, or tuberculosis, I think it was. So the whole family had to move to the Arizona desert, to one of these areas for tuberculosis. And this dry wooden table, he tried to create the driest feeling of what the desert felt like, and this piece of rope hanging, of this old baler twine that was hanging down, and this kind of still life to create the emotion of what he went through as a child in this desert, and what the feeling of his mother was trying to do to keep his children alive in the sanatorium, the community. And when he explained that to the students, people's mouths got really tacky and they got dry, and just, he was able to pull them into space that no one could do. So, in order to be able to do that, you have to be present, and you have to create a pattern of presence on a daily basis. You cannot go to the studio. You have to create at that very moment of what you're doing, as if your life depended upon it. And that's whether it's stacking the firewood or digging the clay or burning the ashes, your presence is critical. So, an awareness, so that some sort of gesture, some sort of, this detail, we gotta make sure when we're burning this straw that we've got to do this, this, and this, and then we got to bring this. So you have to be present. If you're not, you're gonna not feel like you've done your complete work.